Fantasy is an incredibly widespread genre, and there are many different factors which could cause a certain property to be labeled as a fantasy project. Many authors often disagree on what exactly counts as high fantasy versus low fantasy, and a lot of people don't really see a difference at all. Oftentimes I hear people give out blanket statements where they claim that they do not like the fantasy genre one bit. And the more people I get to know, the more I begin to believe that what they really mean is they don't enjoy high fantasy content. Some of the most successful movies and series of all time fit into the low fantasy category. And for the purposes of this video, I wanted to dive into exactly what are the distinctions between each level of fantasy, as well as try to give recommendations of what to look into depending on which category of content you enjoy. The fantasy genre dates back as one of the oldest forms of storytelling. Various myths and folklore go back thousands of years as some of the earliest examples of escapism. For many, that is what's so attractive about the fantasy genre. The ability to escape to another reality and experience levels of storytelling only capable by stretching what we believe to be true. Over the years, there have been many critics who have denounced fantasy and the idea of escapism as a whole, claiming that it is a way of fleeing our responsibilities or being grounded in the real world. In defense of the fantasy genre, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings, had this to say: "Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or, if when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word, and, what is more, they are confusing, not always by error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter." I think this quote perfectly encapsulates why fantasy is my favorite genre, and why for others it can be a hard interest to develop. With how bleak the world can often feel, I have found fantasy content to be an excellent reprieve from the monotony of life, and has often inspired me to continue onward with optimism and hope. Others struggle to understand the sense of getting involved in these worlds of make-believe, and have a hard time understanding why anyone would want to watch a 4-hour movie filled with elves, magic, and wizards. Like I stated earlier, there are far more people who enjoy fantasy content than realize it. There is an innate love of storytelling inside all of humanity, and there is a good reason why it has prevailed as a form of entertainment throughout our entire history. In dividing fantasy among its different levels, I believe you'll find that almost everyone can resonate with and enjoy fantasy content among the different levels of its intensity. And to those who have avoided experimenting and broadening their taste, I hope that this video will give them the inspiration to try. By far the level with the widest appeal, low fantasy content is what most people find themselves enjoying. While there are many debates on what exactly classifies as low versus high fantasy content, moving forward I'm just going to be discerning it by my own scale, which is basically on par with how most people divide them up. Low fantasy is by definition a work featuring fantastical or magical elements that separate a story from our natural world, but often with the degree of fantasy elements dialed down to a lower setting. Often the easiest way to develop a low fantasy project is to simply have it take place in the natural world. Many of the most successful low fantasy worlds find their widespread success by taking our world that everyone is familiar with and adding some sort of magical twist that causes it to differ from our own. This often proves a formula for success, as audiences are not required to learn all the rules of some new magical world, and can instead focus on learning the new magic additions put on top of a pre-established society. By far the most successful and beloved example of low fantasy would be the Harry Potter series, which starts off in the comfortable boundaries of our own world, before revealing that there is a secret, magical society that runs parallel to it. Audiences are still required to learn about the rules of this new world, but thanks to the benefit of having a character previously unexposed to any of it serving as the protagonist, which is extremely common in low fantasy, the nerd homework, as some call it, of needing to learn everything about how the fantasy elements work is lessened and made far more bearable. By mixing reality with fantasy, many middle-of-the-road fans are able to tune in and easily understand the world of Harry Potter. On top of that, a lot of the minutiae, like how the Harry Potter lore works, is often glossed over in the books and the movies. There are plenty of video essays out there breaking down why some of the magic systems in the world of Harry Potter don't exactly make a lot of sense, or have horrifying implications. But most people don't watch Harry Potter for some in-depth explanation into the magical world. They watch it because getting to see a group of friends leave our mundane world and go to wizard school is a really fun idea. Other successful low fantasy works include the Percy Jackson series, which is basically the exact same premise as Harry Potter, but swap out magic and wizards for Greek gods and monsters. Moving away from series targeted towards younger audiences, you have examples like Supernatural, a series following a pair of monster hunters who protect the boundaries between the natural world and, well, the supernatural world. In the same vein, you get the Twilight movies, Ghostbusters, Pirates of the Caribbean, and while it toes the line between sci-fi and fantasy, I would like to include the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole. While the Marvel Cinematic Universe may have started out more in the sci-fi realm, I feel like the further it goes along, it definitely starts to tap into fantasy elements, which I feel like for the purposes of low fantasy could qualify it for this list. All of these projects give fans the opportunity to forget about their problems for a while and get lost in a thrilling adventure. However, in my opinion, in order to really get engrossed in a good series, you have to be willing to take it to the next level. High fantasy content is often characterized by its strong deviations from the natural world. This often comes in the form of the inclusion of magic, monsters, and fantasy races being common features of the story, and almost always includes the creation of an entirely new world for the story to take place on. High fantasy is almost always set in a medieval time period and focuses on telling stories at an either lower or extremely different technological scale. To get it out of the way, I'd like to talk about my favorite fantasy series of all time, which is The Lord of the Rings, and the world of Tolkien's Legendarium. In his world, J.R.R. Tolkien created what many people believe to be the pinnacle of what a high fantasy world should be. In the years that have followed its release, thousands of people have emulated the rules that Tolkien established, and in many ways, The Lord of the Rings serves as the template for all high fantasy. Anytime you see a wizard in a wide-brimmed hat, or elves depicted as a fair, ethereal, and humanoid race, which, before Tolkien, were wholly depicted as small, mischievous, and almost gnome-like creatures, Tolkien is to thank for that, and his world, Middle-earth, stands as one of the most iconic fantasy worlds in all of literature, which, funnily enough, the world of Lord of the Rings is technically supposed to be an ancient version of our world, since the story of Lord of the Rings is supposed to be, for all intents and purposes, Europe mythology, though that's a whole other topic entirely. For the most part, high fantasy has the potential to tell stories that are otherwise impossible in low fantasy. The location, cultures, and conflicts that unfold are often some of the most immersive forms of storytelling available out there. Rarely do I feel as lost in a good book or movie than I do when it's high fantasy. On the more expansive scale of high fantasy, you have projects like Brandon Sanderson's The Cosmere. Sanderson's books explore a high fantasy solar system, which each of the books take place on different planets and all feature a particular magic system that all sort of intertwine in complicated methods. Many series in the Cosmere are still ongoing, and while none have made the jump to the big screen yet, if it did, it would basically be what the Marvel Cinematic Universe is, but for the high fantasy genre. There are numerous high fantasy series out there, though unfortunately for those who aren't big on reading, most are either only accessible through written works or have been translated into a movie or TV show, but to a disappointing degree. Some of my favorite high fantasy projects, and the ones I could most recommend, include The Chronicles of Prydain, Aragon, The Eye of the World, the Shannara series, and Avatar: The Last Airbender. I will admit that my experience in fantasy novels is mostly founded in the classics, and unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good modern high fantasy books to recommend since I haven't gotten around to reading a lot of them. But if you know of any, feel free to leave some in the comments and I'd love to check them out. I'd like to introduce a new category I call middle fantasy, which I consider to be the gray area between high fantasy and low fantasy content. For this section, I'm going to mainly be relying on two key examples of what I consider middle fantasy, and explaining why they may be controversial opinions. Now, first up, I'd like to make my case for why the Chronicles of Narnia should be considered middle fantasy. And while I know it technically fits into the isekai category, I don't care for this video. While there are other portal stories and shows and series like Harry Potter that have clear divisions between the human and magical world, I feel like Narnia is on a different scale altogether. Sure, the story starts out in London during the Second World War, but the fantasy world that these characters travel to isn't an extension of the natural world, it's an entirely new realm. Nothing about the regular world affects the plot at all besides serving as a driving force for our characters to discover Narnia. And once they pass into this new fantasy world, the rules and vibes are straight out of high fantasy. My conflictions with it arise with the fact that the main characters are from our universe, so they are as unfamiliar with Narnia as we all are, and serve as a sort of introduction to us for these new magical creatures and kingdoms. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of stories where someone from our world gets sucked into a fantasy realm, or isekai stories, and they bring with them a slew of impatience or misunderstandings about what they think the world should be. Chronicles of Narnia is perhaps one of the only types of these stories that I don't mind, but it's mostly due to the way that each of the main characters handles their journey into the new world. They aren't constantly making remarks about how society is back home, or how weird things are in Narnia. And once they remark how strange it is to meet a talking beaver, they pretty much accept their new reality and take it seriously from there on out, which is crucial for assisting in the suspension of disbelief. The other main example of middle fantasy, in my opinion, is A Song of Ice and Fire, or as it's more commonly known, Game of Thrones. And I know this one is going to be controversial since almost any article you find online lumps it together with high fantasy, but personally there's just something about it that doesn't scream high fantasy to me. Sure, Game of Thrones is set in a fictional world, There's magic and monsters, but when they are used, it is very sparingly. However, that is not a strong case as to why something shouldn't be considered high fantasy. Some of the works I listed beforehand also feature very little monsters or magic, and yet I consider them high fantasy. So what's the determining factor for Thrones? For me, that comes down to the execution of the project, and the way that watching or reading it almost feels more like a historical account than a make-believe world that could have never existed. I'm not entirely sure where I stand on Game of Thrones, and I go back and forth every day on whether or not I consider it high fantasy. But I think the fact that so many non-fantasy fans are able to connect with it and appreciate it sort of speaks to the point I'm trying to make about it not coming off as pure high fantasy. Regardless, I'm a huge fan of the world building in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I would love to see more from that world. Now, at the end of the day, low fantasy continues to be the more mainstream and successful sector of the fantasy genre. Most works in this category are simply more approachable, and all around require less effort to immerse yourself. In most low fantasy, the main character serves as an insert for the reader. This is what causes them to be so successful, and as much as it pains me to admit it, it's the reason why many people don't personally enjoy high fantasy content. If the show you are watching requires you to exert yourself to understand the geography, magic system, and political affiliations of the kingdoms in the world, most people tune out immediately. In a high-stress world, most people want to turn on a show and forget about the world for a while, without needing to exert their brain to any extent. This is why I bring up the idea of escapism in media, and why I think that so many people out there would truly love the feeling of getting lost in a gripping fantasy world. I do believe that there are so many people out there that are missing out on what could very well be some of their favorite books, movies, and TV shows they've ever seen. Yet, it does take a bit of work to understand some of the denser fantasy worlds out there. But as someone who has undertaken that task time and time again, I can guarantee you it is well worth the effort.